why has it been acceptable for siblings to commit violent acts towards each other? Why has that been the narrative that that's okay? Welcome, John Casby, once again.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, so lovely. I'm going to introduce you briefly, just so for those who don't know you. We're thrilled to have you here, an internationally recognized expert on sibling dynamics, author, speaker, and family therapist. With over 30 years of experience in therapy, and you've written 4 books, including your latest, Raising Loving Siblings, which provides us parents with practical guidance to stop sibling fighting and foster better relationships. And I'm reading it and I'm really enjoying it, taking lots of notes. And yes, I'm looking forward to our conversation to learn more. And you're a full-time professor at Montclair State University and the former director of their PhD program in family studies. You also offer expert insights through media outlets such as NPR, CNN, and the New York Times. And you've been on our podcast, Life's Dirty Little Secrets, twice because we loved it so much. On secret number 28, talking about siblings, and secret number 42, where we talk about raising loving siblings. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I guess you're back. We're having this conversation again. We've had it a few times because it is such a difficult subject, I think about siblings' relationships.
There's such a long history of expecting siblings to fight with each other, and then it's normal. It's in the Bible, it's in every movie, you see it in TV commercials, and there's just this idea that that's what siblings do. And so people they just see it as normal behavior. They don't think of it as violence. And I do this thing with my class, which I don't know if I mentioned before or not, but that I put up a list of violent behaviors on the board and I say, who's allowed to do this to whom? But it would be like, can a coach do this to a child? Can a teacher do it? Can a parent do it? Can a grandparent, an uncle, a neighbor? And the answer is always no. And then we get to a brother. And then there's like a hesitation, and half the students are like, no, I don't think they should. And I'm like, yeah, that wasn't the question, if they should or shouldn't. Is it socially acceptable? Yeah. It's the only form of interpersonal violence that's socially acceptable.
Yeah. So true. And it's quite sad, really, because like we talked about in the podcast, it can lead to so much trauma because you're trapped and your parents aren't protecting you. The very people who should be are not doing that. And it can go on forever. Like we talked about, it can go on even into adulthood in some cases.
Oh, yeah. Even in elder care, it's often siblings who have to care for each other.
Goodness me. Wow. And I thought maybe we could start like talking about what is it that brought you to think about siblings? And why is it so important? Why are we having these conversations? Why do I need to think about my sibling relationships and my children's relationships with each other?
Well, there's some very practical reasons why. One is it's the longest relationship people ever have in their life. It extends from birth or very early childhood, typically all the way through end of life. And there's no other relationship that's really like that, unless perhaps you have some close cousins or something like that. It's also one of the most intense relationships we have, particularly growing up. In research, siblings will say, people will say their best friend is a sibling, and they'll say their worst enemy is a sibling. And often it's the same person. There's a lot of intensity to it. Also, we spend more time with our siblings than anybody else in childhood, more time with our brothers and sisters than with our parents. And so they have a huge impact on us and a huge influence. In fact, you would be a different person if you had different siblings or if you didn't have a sibling, because much of who we are is in reaction to our developmental experiences with our siblings growing up. And that's actually what got me into siblings. Is when I went back to school for a PhD, all you do is read and read. And I came across this research article called Why Are Siblings So Different, which came out in 1990, my memory's correct. And in research, siblings are as different as random people off the street.
Crazy.
So, yeah, crazy, right? And so when you look at personality tests, and you give 2 siblings a personality test, and then you give 2 random strangers personality tests, the strangers score as similar, or the better way to say it is the sibling score as different as random pairs of strangers. And I read this and I thought to myself, there's no way that this can be true, because siblings have so much shared environment. They grow up in the same houses, eat the same food, experience the same maternal happiness or depression and paternal happiness and depression, and they go to the same schools, typically play in the same regions. It's just same, not to mention that genetics alone should make you more similar. And at the end of the article, it said something like, we're biogeneticists, we don't have an explanation, and maybe somebody else can explain it. And I thought, that's really interesting. I would really like to find out why. And it turns out that it's because we live and grow up with our siblings that we're so different from each other.
Yeah.
And I can explain some of that as we go, but that was one huge moment where I went, oh, wow, I got to pay more attention to this. And the other was this research finding, which I did not know at all, which is that siblings are responsible for the most child maltreatment and child victimization of any other source. That when you look at how widespread abuses against children, usually people think of parent abuse of children, maybe bullying, but sibling violence happens way more than those two things combined, plus domestic violence or partner battering combined. It's extremely prevalent. And so millions and millions of children, at a minimum, the lowest number that we've ever seen come up in research, and there's been quite a bit now, is 1 in 3. And it's usually much higher than that. So imagine how many millions of kids we're talking about. And somewhere in the 6 to 7%, so we're still talking about millions of kids, experience extreme forms of abuse that cause injury.
Wow.
And somewhere between 2 and 4% of kids are threatened with a weapon.
Wow.
So that's also millions. But that's a lot of this research is US research.
Right. Yeah.
So it may differ in places where maybe weapons aren't so available.
Just touching on that last part, because it is so shocking. And obviously when we talk about sibling violence, we're talking about when siblings really hurt each other. And that is more than all other kinds of interpersonal violence put together. A number of siblings that hurt each other. That is so shocking.
Yeah, the intent to do harm.
The intent to do harm. And it's intent as opposed to by mistake.
Right.
Yeah.
If two kids are wrestling and they're goofing around and one hurts the other kid, that's just play that got a little out of hand. But if they're intending to do it because they're angry, they got hurt, or they're losing the match, that's violence.
And that's what we're referring to here.
It's about using violent behavior to solve a problem in the relationship, either your own problem or the problem in the relationship.
Yeah.
Like you have a disagreement or a fight, and that's the way you were trying to resolve it instead of verbally and constructively.
Yes, which is obviously something that we would never allow our children to do. Like in theory, we wouldn't want them to resort to violence to resolve an argument in a bar or in a playground. That's not something that we would want them to be learning was acceptable. And yet in some families, sounds like in a lot of families, that's what's happening between siblings.
Yeah, and I don't know that there's any direct line between corporal punishment, spanking, and using physical punishments with your kids. But something like 90% of parents say that they will spank their toddlers. And why do people spank their kids? It's usually because they don't really know what else to do. They just get so frustrated and overwhelmed that they're like, if you had other strategies, you probably wouldn't do it. But it is modeling, what do you do when you're frustrated?
Yeah, that's right. And what you just said is because you don't have other strategies, and we'll come up with that exact thing during our conversation today, how to teach siblings to have better strategies than violence. But I think it's really important for us as parents and clinicians to recognize this bias that we unfortunately have, where we make sibling violence acceptable. I think we wouldn't admit it out loud, but because it is happening in our households, clearly, because the statistics show, there's obviously a bias that somehow it makes it on one level or another acceptable. That's what siblings do. They do fight. It's inevitable, but it doesn't need to be so.
No, it doesn't. And you and I have talked about this before, that people expect their kids are going to fight with each other because it's been so normalized.
Yeah.
And so do professionals. A typical example that I use with my classes is if you show up in an emergency room with a broken arm and the intake nurse says, "How did that happen?" and you say, "My father pushed me down the stairs," there would be a call to Child Protective Services. But if you say, "My brother pushed me down the stairs," it's probably, "Okay, let's wrap it up and get you home."
Gosh, horrendous. But you're right, there is that bias, isn't there? And I think as parents, we need to take responsibility for that and make sure that we don't have that bias and that we're actually armed with better tools to deal with conflict between siblings so that they don't fight. I don't think parents generally seeing their kids fighting, be it physically or verbally. So part of this conversation is to give parents better tools, including myself. I'm so on the lookout for that.
I wrote the book and sometimes I mess up, so
yeah, I love that. I love that you referred to that. And I loved an example that you gave in one of the podcasts where your kids are having an argument at the table and you said, "Can I just stop you now and remind you that I'm a siblings expert?"
That's right. Good memory.
I love that. I know it's quite humbling. And to recognize that it's difficult when our emotions are running high. Like when we're upset by what we're seeing, we're going to be less skillful. And that's why you talk a lot about not winging it. So let's touch on that in a minute. So I thought we were talking a bit about how siblings are so different. Then we moved into sibling violence because that is really important to highlight because it's shocking and still happens, obviously. But when we come to siblings being different, you mentioned in your book the role of competitiveness, both for good and for bad. Could you talk to that a little bit? How does competitiveness or how does comparison shape us when it comes to our siblings' relationship? How do we get shaped by, the competitiveness? Because it's inevitable, like you've said in other conversations, that we do compare from the minute they're in our belly. Like you said, they're kicking more than your sibling. They're moving about more than your sibling. We're constantly comparing. And how does that influence their identity or the way they are? Is that one of the vehicles by which they're so different?
Yes, that's a great question. When you compare people, any two people, you tend to compare them in the direction of opposites. You're neat and I'm sloppy, right? Or you're outgoing and I'm shy, or you're silly and I'm serious. And those comparisons are like the extreme versions of it, when you can have two people who are pretty similar in terms of how silly they are, but if one's more silly, then they become the silly one and the other one becomes more serious. And then that gets reinforced through all the interactions with each other and with the parents. And so the very act of comparing makes kids different from each other. And parents often overemphasize the differences. There's actually a study on that. And we help to create that. But the competition is somewhat inevitable, as you say, but it's also, there's good competition and there's bad competition. And competing over parental attention can get dicey sometimes, and it's not the best kind of competition. And that gets fueled by comparison, because if a parent likes a particular kind of characteristic or trait better, then you have winners and losers, and people don't want to be in the loser position. But if kids are competing with each other, say they're playing tennis against each other, the bad version is, "I just beat you in your face, you're a loser, I can crush you every time, I'm so much better than you." It's like the intent is to diminish their self-esteem and to injure. But good competition is, "Man, that was a great shot. I barely could get my racket on it," or "You got me this time, but I'm going to get you next time," but in a playful way. And that actually makes people improve their skills. You become a better tennis player that way, because you have a supportive partner that you keep trying to outdo. But nobody improves by having their self-esteem or their self diminished.
Yeah. Because it's interesting, in your book, you make reference to some of the famous siblings, like the Williams sisters, and how they were very competitive, fiercely competitive, but very supportive at the same time, and how that helped to build their skills. Because on the one hand, it's like a paradox. On the one hand, siblings will look for different niches so that they are not competing with each other. Like you said, one might be in the choir and the other one is in tennis, or one might be, like you said, the class clown and the other one will be the serious one. So that in a way we have our parents' attention for the pieces that we do well or the pieces that we do differently. But sometimes they'll do the same thing. And that seems to work as well in terms of...
It can.
Yeah.
They'll expect more conflict if they're in the same niche or territory, because there's more opportunities to be compared, not just by parents and not just to each other, but by coaches and other parents and so on. Kids can be coached or taught by their parents how to participate in the same niche in productive ways. So it doesn't have to be about outdoing each other, but rather seeing that we're teammates and we're both competing for the same thing here.
Yeah. You've got me thinking with this competitiveness and comparison that it's inevitable that as parents, so we have to have our eyes on that competitiveness and that comparison. It's inevitable that they will be competing against each other. It's like a resource allocation. There's a limited resource, which is our parents' attention. But just to be mindful of how we speak of our children in front of their children so that we try and avoid as much comparison as possible, and encouragement is more the name of the game. Is that right?
Yeah, and also having them see each other as allies or teammates rather than as adversaries. And when they see each other as adversaries, it's because the comparison is making them think they're fighting over the more favored position. Because if you have two kids in basketball and one is better at basketball than the other, the parent is likely more excited about going to their games and they're getting trophies and people are really lighting up. They're like, wow, your child is really good. And the other one's kind of in the shadow and they're like, I don't really want to play basketball anymore. That competition between them is fostered by that comparison, rather than saying you're both good at basketball, you just play differently, you're different ages, you can help each other get better. I'm proud of both of you.
It's hard, isn't it? It's not an easy one to navigate, because the community, if you have somebody who's exceptional and somebody who's not as strong, they will be getting so many messages of you being better than. And as parents, we just have to be really mindful of how we communicate at home and how we encourage them. The thing of being allies is so true. Sometimes with the kids, it's kids versus parents at sports, at board games, to be honest, they're often better.
I like that though. They should be allied against their parents, and the parents should be allied against their kids. If there's lines to be drawn, that's where the line should be.
I agree. And they love it. There's nothing better than them beating us. So you can see how competitiveness can actually strengthen their bond as long as they're working together. And often it's inevitable that competitiveness between them can lead them to work against each other. That's just something as parents we need to keep an eye on, that we're not reinforcing that narrative in any way, that somebody
do it. I'm sorry, we usually do it outside of our own awareness.
Yeah.
That's the thing, is like, for example, there's research, which I know you're familiar with because we've talked about it, which is that the more parents get involved in their children's relationships, the worse the sibling relationship is. And it's not because we're getting involved, it's how we get involved. So there's two big ones, and this might address one of the other questions you had coming up, but there's two big reasons why parents create more conflict in the house, but they do it inadvertently. One is that when the kids are fighting with each other, the parents usually come in on the behalf of the smaller one or the younger one.
I'm guilty of that. Yeah.
Yeah, you're not the only one. I've done it myself, and I've written about it now for 25 years. But we come in and we say things like, leave your little sister alone, or you're older, you should know better, or be a good big sister and let her have your toy. Doing that, we're basically saying, I have the little one's side, and then the older one is pushed to be more outside, and then they resent the fact that, why is mom or dad have their back and not my back? And where does that resentment go? And more conflict. And so
Yeah.
you get more sibling conflict. So we don't do that intentionally. It's almost reflexive as parents that we want to protect the little one from the bigger one.
It's like I'm hearing my family reenacted here. Absolutely. And even though this is our third conversation, I still see myself falling into that trap. So that perception of favoritism is one of the sort of systemic issues that we can come up against in families, even though it's not our intention. When we protect or we take the side inadvertently of one of the kids, then that'll be perceived as favoritism, and that will worsen their dynamic. And you just get stuck in a cycle, don't you? Because their conflict goes up, so you take sides more often and the conflict goes up. So that piece around...
And part of the reason the conflict goes up is because once the older one gets more resentful and aggressive, but the younger one also learns, like, oh, mom or dad has my back. So they can initiate conflict. And now you're entering into a situation in which one of the children is being rewarded. And so now they have incentive to actually antagonize their older sibling. And it's not always younger to older, but it often is. Or take the toys out, or they're getting rewarded, and the parent doesn't know that they're rewarding that behavior.
Yeah. And it can be subtle. Ever since we've been having these conversations, I've been noticing things like telling on each other. So my little one will go, hey, so-and-so is still on his device, or let's creep into the house really quietly so we catch them.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. She's so cheeky.
But she made you she said, you're my ally. We're going to do this together. We're a team and we're going to get him. Yeah.
Catch them at it. And of course, our ears prick and go, what do you mean they're still on devices? And what do you mean they're going to be doing X, Y, Z? What? And you kind of storm in and whatever. So you have to be on the game that not to get pulled into these sort of dances that, or dynamics that are so ineffective in the long term, because it will feel like, of course, I need to handle this right now. But over the course of time, you're creating, like you said, you're giving her power, or him, whoever it is, the individual power over the rest. And they're not happy about that at all. Not that they should be on screens or doing whatever it is that they're not supposed to be doing, but it's not on her to tell us or on the kids to tell us. We should be managing them independently.
That's true. That's such a common thing where kids try to gain favor by getting their siblings in trouble. And there is a section towards the end of the book on the difference between tattling and telling, and then how to intervene, because tattling is exactly like you said. I'm just trying to get my sibling in trouble. Yeah. Telling is when there's real danger. We don't want to entertain tattling. So if a child says to us, oh, they're still on their device, you can tell them that's none of their business, or that you don't appreciate tattling. And if they tattle again, then they're in trouble. Raise the stakes for them. But you still want them to tell you if there's danger. So if their sibling is like playing with matches where you keep your newspapers, you want them to say they're playing with matches. So you don't want to set a rule that they're not supposed to talk about their sibling at all, but you want to teach them, if it's dangerous, you can tell me, but I don't want to know if they're on their device or if they're doing handstands in the room. I know some people might think that's dangerous, but you get my point.
Yeah. And sometimes it's a fine line between one and the other. If I think of, for example, relationships that they might be having, and one of the sibling goes, I really don't like their friend. I don't think they're good for them. Yeah, it can feel intrusive as well. But it might be something like, I know that there's a lot of wisdom, that siblings have a lot of wisdom about each other. And I'll listen to that, but I won't necessarily enact anything. But I'll just hold that information. So I don't discourage them saying things about their siblings. Oh, I noticed that they were, I don't know, playing with this person, and I'm not sure they're the best choice of friends, or he was fighting during playtime with this, that could be irrelevant information, but it could be relevant. So I think there's sometimes a fine line. Some is obviously my daughter saying, let's catch them. That's just clearly to get them in trouble. And she loves the idea, which is, anyway, we're working on that, a work in progress. But yeah, siblings sharing about other aspects of each other's lives can be seen as care and concern, but it's a fine line. So I'm just looking at the other question. I had so many questions just to make sure. So one of the questions I had for you last time as well, and I still think about it, is that obviously these situations that we're referring to when it comes to sibling conflict, when it gets out of hand and we tend to wing it, where we get involved because sibling conflict can be very upsetting to see, but it can be very frustrating because it can be very repetitive. Like we find if you start to track, because that's what I've been doing, tracking what are the sort of touch points of their conflict, you'll see that it's very repetitive. It's usually at the same times. And like you mentioned in the book, straight after school when they're hungry and tired. And I've had my eyes on that, making sure that they've eaten before they talk to each other. It's a great tip. It's just such a good tip, even when they're 12 and 14.
Like when they're 40.
When they're 40, actually, with my husband, don't speak to me till you've eaten. You're right. That's just we just assume that they'd be able to say, I can't speak now, I'm hungry, but that's not how it works. It's grisly or tired, and helping them, teaching them that they need to eat and rest in order to act their best selves. So those kind of transitions and being mindful of when conflict happens during those transitions, it could be that there's hunger or they need time alone, and that we preempt that so that we're ahead of the game. So I've definitely noticed that there's a pattern to their conflict, that it happens same places, and also that there are themes. For example, when they don't agree with each other, when they don't like what the other one's doing or saying. One area of conflict in my family, which may be just my family, is how they're sitting at the table and how they're eating. And I'm thinking, why is that such a big deal? But fine, that is the topic that seems to wind them up the most of late. And so to be ahead of the game, because as you said in your fabulous book, winging it usually ends with us taking sides, which is that favoritism, and it just doesn't really, in the long term, doesn't help. Having said that, massive amount of self-compassion, because I regularly wing it still to this day, despite all the conversations we've had and how many books I've read still for it.
Parenting is so hard.
Oh, it really is. It really is. And conflict is hard. And because you siblings do have, and like you said, the closer they are, the more the conflict. We do see a lot of conflict. So maybe we could touch on, so we all want to prevent winging it as best we can because it isn't very effective in the long term. So in order to prepare us, have these rules of engagement that you talk about, which I thought was a really good way of describing it. Is the sort of process, the best way to start is to look for those touch points, those moments in the day where they're most likely to happen, and then brainstorm with the kids how we want to be at those times?
If you can track when siblings mostly fight and how they fight with each other, then you can almost predict like how it's going to happen, and then you can lay down rules for what they should do instead of what they're doing. If it's always going to be like a dinner time, like you said, you have a meeting before you're ever sitting at dinner and after they're already fed. And this is super, super important. Your parenting partner, if it's your spouse or your parent or a nanny, whomever, they have to be on board for the same thing, because otherwise the parents will undermine each other and the kids will just get away with whatever they want to do. Parents have to be on the same team. So I highly recommend that if they're little, the parents should get together first. Or if the parents are having their own disagreements about things, have to get together first and come up with a shared plan, and then have a family meeting with the kids and say, we notice that you fight a lot at dinner time, and it's making our dinners not fun and very uncomfortable. And we notice that you pick on each other a lot about the way you eat or the way you hold your fork or what kind of sounds you're making, whatever silly things kids kind of get wrapped up about. That has to be annoying and frustrating for you too. It can't be comfortable. So let's talk about what we can do instead at dinner time. And then you can co-create. If they're little, you can just tell them what the rules are. If they're bigger, you can co-construct together what the rules are. And it may have a lot of no's, like you're not allowed to make a comment about how somebody's eating or the noises they're making, or whether the mouth's open or not open, those kind of things. But this is what you can do instead. And if it's really bothering you that somebody's chewing with their mouth open, and you both have to be on board with this, you can say, can you please please close your mouth when you're chewing, and not make it into a big deal. And the other person on the other end has to say, okay, I didn't realize I was doing it. I will do my best. And then you can even rehearse those things. And then when you get to the dinner table, and then somebody will inevitably still fall back in their old pattern and make a agitated comment, you have to remind them, you remember what we talked about. If you continue to fight like this, here's a consequence. You'll lose time on your device or your phone or whatever it is. And then, but if you do it, you can offer rewards too. You'll get more time on your device, and you can do both ends depending on how egregious the crime is, so to speak. And this is the most important thing, is that you have to give kids a chance to try it again. So if they say something and they mess up, you don't go, all right, that's it, you're done, leave the table and give me your phone. But rather you say, nope, remember what we talked about. You got to emotionally regulate yourself and stay calm. Remember what we talked about. Here are the rules. Try it again. And then they might get a little snarky the first time and go, can you please close your mouth when you chew? Like that. You no, that's not what we talked about. That's not, you got one more chance. It's up to you. One more chance. And then usually most children will choose the behavior that will get them the reward that they're looking for, or avoid the consequence. Now, there are some kids which will not. They'll keep challenging, and then you have to apply the consequence, because if you don't, then you've just given them permission to continue.
And then, so let's follow that through, because I can imagine myself at the table reminding them of the rule, and them continuing or whining or getting annoyed. Yes, but I wasn't eating with my mouth open, blah, blah, blah. And even when we say, hey, you've got a choice on how to respond. Do you want to try that again? Why does he get to, which is usually the conversation, right? Why does he, why does she? And then we say, you've made a choice. You're going to lose 10 minutes on your screens. And then chances are it'll escalate further.
There may be a few reasons why it escalates further, and one of them is you have to really identify what their currency is. If 10 minutes on the phone is a big deal to them, they should stop. If it's not that big of a deal, then they'll escalate, because it's not enough of a consequence or a reward to get 10 more minutes. Losing it for the rest of the evening, now that may be if the phone is their thing. If it's playing video games, then that's their thing. If it's being able to go outside and play basketball, although you don't really want to limit their exercise, but you look for what, little kids, it might be like you lose your special stuffed animal. It could really be, whatever it is that leverages your power a little bit. But even that other behavior you were talking about, which is why does he get to and why does she get to, that's the same thing. We wing that too, and we don't have to. We can say, when you guys fight, you always bring up the other one, and we're number one, we're not entertaining that anymore. So if you do it, there will be a consequence. But instead, what you should do is focus on your own behavior, because I'm not really involved with. I'm not. If you say, "What about so-and-so?" the consequence for you is only going to get worse.
Nice. We have permission to do that. I love that. That is literal.
Yeah, you'll get pushback. Remember, especially, look, whenever you try a new intervention or something new for the first time, the kid's job is to figure out, are you serious, or is this just one of your thing of the week that you're trying out on me here? And they'll push back. You have to stay consistent with it and do it multiple times before it starts to stick. And if you do it 3 times and it's still not working, you can't go, this strategy doesn't work. maybe you're still implementing it in a clumsy way, or maybe the currency is not enough, or maybe the kids don't take you seriously yet. If you've been feeding a dog from the table, and I hate to compare dogs and kids, so forgive me, but if you give a dog a
Okay.
treat from the dinner table, they will keep coming back to the dinner table hoping for another treat. There's a long-standing pattern that's already been established in families, and now you're trying to establish a new pattern, and it takes a while for it to take. So you lay out the rules, and then you have to stick with it. And if you say you're losing your phone for the evening, the other parent can't go, they've been so good for the past couple hours, or they've been good for
Yeah.
30
Can't earn
minutes.
it back.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
give it back. Like, it's not such a big deal.
Yes. So this is great because in preparation for today, I've been looking at my children and thinking I've got lots of material to talk about. And that was exactly one of the ones that I couldn't put my finger on, which is that behavior of what about him? What about her? So typical. And I wasn't sure, there isn't a clear trigger. It happens quite regularly. Whenever you pull them up on something, have you cleared let's say we're clearing the table. Come on, everybody's going to help. Thanks for doing that. Thanks for doing your part. And maybe one of them is clearing up more than the other. And so they'll go, yeah, but what about her? She's only done da. And often it will result in mind your own business, just sort your own pieces off. Oh, but that's not fair. And it will escalate. So instead of falling into that pattern, what you're saying is have a conversation beforehand and say, we will not be tolerating the what about her, what about him. Instead, we want you to think about your own behavior. Now, how do we reward when they're thinking about their own behavior? Because it may not be something that they'll voice.
That's a great question. Before I get to that, just wanted to add to this what about him, what about her comparison. It's so common. I mean, that's like a reflex for a lot of kids and their families. Like, how come I have to clean up my room? Or how come I have to do this? Did they do it? Did they clean up their room?
Exactly.
And it's, to me, it's incredibly annoying. It's almost like they're sitting next to you and just like poking.
Yeah, 100%.
And would you tolerate that? You wouldn't. So why do we engage in these behaviors that feel like we're getting poked at and being like challenged in this way?
Yeah.
And so you do, again, it requires both parents to do it, because if one of them is not, they're going to continue doing it. I guarantee you. The rule is that you don't compare yourself to your sibling that way, or you don't ask us, like, use a strategy to try to get out of doing something because you don't think your sibling has done the same. That you approach it the same way, and you say, look, next time you say that, and we know we keep coming back to the phone because that's a big one for kids, that you're not going to have your phone anymore. Or if you're a family that doesn't want to use negative consequences and only wants to use incentives, you can say, you have to earn your phone, and this is part of earning. This is part of the earning process. And when you challenge me like that, it means that you're going to either lose time on your phone or you're not earning time on the phone. So come to you and they go, why didn't he do that? Why do I have to when he didn't? And then you just remind them, remember what we talked about. We're not comparing. I'm not having a conversation with you about what you do versus what he did. I asked you to put the dishes away, and I'm very proud of you for putting the dishes away. And let's focus on what you need to do. And if you do it, then everything will go smoothly. And then if they challenge you, you have to say, I get it. You want to talk about that, but I'm not going to. Let's try again. Here's the consequence. Here's the reward. You tell me which behavior you want to choose and put it back on them.
Yeah. And so in a way, you've answered my question, which is, if we see them, so how do they earn their phone, for example, if that's the reward? By doing the things that we want them to see. So if our goals are for them to be kind when they speak to each other, for them to help out with chores, for them to help each other out when they need help, that might not be a verbal exchange. It might just be an act. So when they're doing, that's where you catch them when they're good, and you say, awesome, you've just earned 5 minutes on the phone, or whatever it might be that the currency is, or half an hour, whatever, or you're going to go out and play with your friends, whatever it might be. Is that the way to do it? To name it in the moment?
Naming it in the moment is great, and catching them being good is great, because that's, most parents focus on the negative behaviors and don't catch people doing the good behavior. But also, I have this discussion actually with parents a lot. Parents get pulled into all kinds of lengthy back and forths with kids, and there's no need for it. If I asked you to wash the dishes, I asked you to wash the dishes. I didn't ask for a 20-minute conversation about who does the dishes and who did it Wednesday night and who did it that. And so the reward for the kid is getting the parent to talk to them about it for 20 minutes. And in other words, like when your kid says to you, what about my brother? And you get into it, you've just given them a huge present, which is, I'm going to now get worked up and upset and talk to you about this for the next 20 minutes and fight with each. And why do that? I asked you to do the dishes. Here's your choice. Do the dishes and get the reward. Don't do it. Here's the consequence. You want to talk about your brother? Here's the consequence. You just do what we asked you to do. Here's the reward. And then, just as an aside, this is a complete aside, at a different time, not in those moments, but at a different time, you can sit down with your kids and have a serious conversation about it. You bring up this idea of fairness a lot, and let's talk about it. If you really feel that things are unfair, and if they are, let's put it on the table and have a real conversation about it. And then listen, don't just deny it right away, because sometimes we're blind to our own ways of being unfair. But if both kids are doing it to each other, it's likely not a question of fairness. It's likely that the fight is being rewarded.
So I was thinking about that and how we have to be so smart as parents and to notice how we get sucked in. I've been sucked in just listening to you saying that, where one of my kids has gone, yeah, but dad, not even the siblings. Yeah, but dad. And I'll be like, does he? Is that true? Is he doing this? And I'll be like questioning, is he doing that? That is not okay. And I'm like starting to review. In the meantime, my kid's not doing the thing they're meant to be doing. Like I'm pulled into this comment. And then I'll go to my husband. I go, is that true? Have you been doing this and that? And he's, what are you talking about? So it's so smart. And my husband pulled me up on it and he goes, why do you keep asking me these questions? Why are you giving this so much airtime? I'm like, because I wouldn't like it if it were true. I'm like, give me the benefit of the doubt first. Deal with the situation and then we can talk about it. But you're right. You can get pulled in as a parent to have conversations, to delay. And like you said, in a way, it delays them having to do it. Maybe that's part of the reason why they're engaging in these conversations. But it's
also fun to get a rise out of parents a little bit. It makes them feel powerful. This kind of years ago, I had a graduate student say to me, I asked my kid to practice piano for 20 minutes a day, only 20 minutes. But he will argue with me for about an hour about practicing for 20 minutes. And I said, why are you talking to him for an hour? That's like literally a 10-second discussion. I said, the reason why that's happening is he is enjoying talking to you for an hour. He has your full attention. He's got you riled up. He feels very powerful. And he doesn't have to practice the piano.
Yeah, totally. They're so smart. That's so smart.
I don't know that they're doing it deliberately.
No, I don't think they are.
Yeah.
It's when you stop and you take a step back and you go, why is this happening? Why am I getting frustrated? What's going on here in this dynamic that's really not working? Because I think often as parents, we know when we're getting stuck. We're just not attending to that experience of stuckness. We're too busy attending to what's happening in our head and what's being said. But it's a good cue for me to notice this feeling of dread and frustration. And then I need to take a step back and think, what's going on that's not working? Because that's telling me something's really not working.
Yeah, I think that's very good advice.
Yeah. So I wanted to touch on a couple of things before we finish. So we've touched on the parental involvement and how that can make things worse, but preemptive parental involvement can make things better, like having that sort of thoughtful planning and intervening effectively in the moment. So if the kids are fighting, for example, and you're not liking the sound of it, it doesn't look like it's very effective. we can intervene with our plan of action. We have our rules of engagement. We can go in and go, whatever it is that the agreement. Do you remember that agreement? We said we weren't going to speak to each other like this. You have a choice to try that again, or here's the consequence. So that's really helpful, and really be very intentional with that. And so the other piece I wanted to touch on is that question, that comment that you raised just a moment ago around fairness. It's such a huge topic in families, fairness. And it got me thinking, in your book, you talk about fairness not being the same as equal treatment because children at different ages need different things. And how do we balance that? It feels like it's inevitable that they will feel that treatment is unfair. Is that true? Like, how can I not treat my children unfairly in their eyes because one child needs more support, or one child's younger, or one child's doing more activities than the other one and needs to be taxied around more? So how do we handle that inevitable imbalance, what appears to be imbalance?
It is a really tough issue for families. Parents are in a lose situation when it comes to fairness. There really is no winning, so we do the best we can. And what I mean by that is this. If you look at research on sibling fairness, for example, it equates to a little bit close to if you were to like share something with your sibling. 2 for me, 1 for you. That's fair. That's through the sibling eyes. That's usually what it is. So try it sometime. If you're with one of your siblings, I think you said you had sisters, right?
Yeah.
And they're eating a sandwich, ask them for half the sandwich and see how they reply.
Yeah.
Say, it's only fair. We should have the same. I get half. Usually they go, half? You can have a bite, but you can't have half. That's usually the way people respond. And we even know, we go, can I have a bite of that? Or can I have a little of that? We don't generally ask for a half, right? Because we know that the idea of fairness is I get more if it's mine than you get. And so if the idea is I'm supposed to get more than you, then how are parents supposed to be equal? If you cut a birthday cake into 2 equal slices, neither one of them is going to see that as particularly fair. And if you're with other kids at the party, they just go, thank you for the cake. But inevitably the sibling's going to go, how come you got more than I did? And then you get into that kind of, you're not being fair. You're giving them more than you're giving me. And they pay very close attention to those little tiny, you need a microscope to tell the difference.
100%.
It's a lose. And so give yourself permission to know that it's a lose. Don't get all wrapped up in it. It's okay. But the trick to fairness is this, really. Kids understand. They really do. Little kids maybe less. And if there's any cognitive delays or neurodivergence, sometimes that's a challenge. But kids generally understand that they're different from each other and that their parents are going to treat them differently. And the only time you get really bad accusations of favoritism is when they don't understand why. Like, why is it that you're spending more time with one than the other, or that one seems to get a bigger hug or more cake on their plate, or whatever it is? If they can't figure out why the other child is getting more attention and more investment, then they start to think, okay, now this is unfair. You'll never hear a kid complain if they're good at math and their sibling is not. How come I can't have a tutor too?
No.
They only complain the other way.
Yeah, it's so true.
Why do I have to have a tutor? And sometimes I'll use that jokingly with my own kids. Why do we have to have it the same? Oh, you want 4 tutors? I'll be happy to get you 4 tutors.
It's so true. It really isn't the other way around. My kids will say, why does my daughter's younger, why does she get X, Y, Z? And I said, do you want me to treat you like I treat her? You're going to have to give me your phones and you can't go on your own in the underground. We're like, oh, no, I just want that part, not the rest.
Right. So you won't get to fairness, but what you will get to, what you try to get to, is an understanding that different kids need different things at different times. And so parents are going to behave differently along the way. I think, and this is just observational, I don't have any research to support this, but I actually think younger children, the babies, the youngest, pay more attention in some ways because they have this kind of looking up version. Like you
Mhm.
said, like how come they get to have their phone and I don't, right?
Yeah.
Or how come they get to stay up till 9 or 10 o'clock at night and I don't? And so they're very aware of the difference, but they don't realize that when their older brother or sister was the same age, you probably had very similar rules and that they are being treated the same.
Yeah.
It's the reverse that's actually more likely to be common, which is that the older one probably has to wait till like 14 or 13 before they get their phone. And meanwhile, the other one's 9 and they have their phone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
so it's very hard to treat kids the same. But what you do want to do is have conversations about fairness and not just in the moments when they're upset or they
Yeah.
want to argue with you. Like
Yeah.
really be able to sit down and talk about how sometimes they're going to get more and sometimes you're going to get more.
Yeah, and accept that they may not be happy with it. I think we talk about our Jedi skills. I talk about Jedi skills a lot. And I think one of the Jedi skills as a parent is our ability to tolerate and be okay with our kids being disappointed with us.
100%. Yes,
And it's so
absolutely.
hard. It's so hard. And it can appear unfair, and we can have the chat and we can hear them and we can validate them. And yet it's still like that. It's not going to change. And they can be disappointed with us or
They
angry or
can.
whatever else.
What you don't want though is a pattern of it, right? That does turn into favoritism. Because one of the things when people complain about being unfair, they do it in a way that reinforces the unfairness. They go, why do they get more? And it's unfair. And they get like whiny and annoying. And you're like,
Yeah, so
now I
true.
really do like your sibling better than you.
It's so true. It's so true. And then that sort of inevitability that we have to accept that some of us are matched better with some of our children than others. And I think that's okay to accept. It doesn't need to influence our behavior, and we have to have our eyes on that. But some of our kids are easier to get on with. And it could be that we spend more time with them as a result. But we need to, as parents, take responsibility and make sure that doesn't get out of hand. And it can go through seasons, can it? That you get on with one kid better and to be on to
Just the
that.
activities they get involved in. My oldest kid played a lot of baseball, so we spent a lot of time in the car together, going to games and
Yeah.
practices and talking, and we got to some very deep conversations. And then he
Nice.
went off to college, and my daughter played soccer, and we spent a lot of time in the car going to practices, and I got to have that time with her. And the similar behaviors at similar ages, they don't get to see it, but there is a season to it. It was my son's season first, and now it's her season, and it's just part of what parenting involves. And you're 100% right that sometimes they're not going to be happy and they're going to be frustrated, and that's okay as long as it's not a repeating pattern. And if it seems like it is and they're complaining about it in that way, you'd have to take it seriously and go, all right, I'm really going to listen and not be defensive and not make this about me. The
Yeah.
other piece I just wanted to throw in there, which is a tough one as well, is what you were just talking about. And I just had this, I teach a class on siblings at my university, and I was just talking about this today. That it gets involved with the activities that you really like you're really into like art, and then they become really into art. You're like, oh, this is awesome, I love this, and now we're like super close and connected and we can talk about all of this stuff. But if your child is like says, no, I'm going to be into rugby, and you're like, rugby, I don't even like rugby, that's you don't get to do that as a parent. You have to be like, this isn't about me and me liking rugby or not. If they love it and they're really talented and they're interested in it, I'm going to get excited. I'm going to learn how to get excited about it so that you can have that kind of relationship with them.
Both are true. It's important and difficult because some things can be so boring for us as parents.
Oh,
But it's important, right? To do the best we can and to be kind and gentle to ourselves, that we don't have to do a perfect job. But some leaning in to those areas of interest can be magical for them. One last question that I have, because it got me thinking about one of the things that you talk a lot about is how closeness is inevitably going to lead to conflict. Like the two can't happen without each other, which got me thinking about that because we also don't want to see conflict. So if we see conflict, is that a sign that they're close? Does it work that
not
way?
necessarily.
Not necessarily. It depends the conflict.
The reason why people who are close get into more fights is because they spend a lot more time together, and then they get involved in the same activities, and sometimes they disagree about how those activities should go down. And it's not just limited to siblings. This is husbands and wives struggle with this all the time. You spend a lot of time with each other, you're eventually going to bump into something that you disagree about. And that's actually a good thing, because when you do disagree, it gives you an opportunity to grow. Because if somebody always agrees with you, you just never grow up. But also it's hard, and it brings you closer together, because we're in this together, and we go through the bad together, and now we're even more connected because of it. And that's true with siblings too. And when the siblings fight with each other, if they're fighting in a way that's not doing harm or causing damage or being so annoying because it's just the same BS, then let them fight and let them resolve it. You don't have to get involved in it because they're fighting with each other. Sometimes my clients, sometimes that's what sound machines are for.
Yeah. Earplugs.
Yeah, exactly. Let them figure it out, because ultimately that'll bring them closer. If you get involved and you're in the middle, they don't have that opportunity to do their own repair work, which is so important in relationships.
So there really is a sweet spot, isn't there, between noticing our kids' and I mentioned in our podcast how when my boys fought, they tried to pull me in. I'd say, I'm confident you can figure this out. Just be calm. Remember how we talk to each other. And then I'd leave often. And they would inevitably figure it out. And I remember mentioning it to one of my sons the other day before our podcast. And he said, yeah, you'd always say that. But they did figure it out. And I think that's the sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. They figured it out. So I felt more confident doing that. And so it went on. And I guess that's where they learned to navigate conflict very well, because they had the tools to do. I guess where we need to be more mindful and preempt conflict when it's not functional, when it's dysfunctional, it's causing harm. And it's that repetitive.
Yeah, that like that dinner table thing, when it's disrupting your dinner and making it just that, having rules for that and not tolerating that and getting involved with that, totally fine. But if they're in another room playing video games and they get into a disagreement about which character they're going to be, there's no reason to be involved unless they're doing dangerous things to each other, like either calling each other bad names or pushing and shoving each other, hitting. Otherwise, you figure out your video games. I'm not needed for that.
Yeah, it's quite refreshing to do that. Wonderful. Any final thoughts? Anything else? I think we've covered a lot. I have kept you for a long time once again with all my questions.
Mondays are long, so it's okay though. No, I think you hit the most important parts. The thing about being planful and having a plan, it's the same as anything in life. If you're going to give a big speech, you want to be prepared before you get on stage. And you don't want to just go up there and wing it. And it's the same thing with kids. You don't want to just wing it. You want to be prepared and have a plan and a strategy. And then you can emotionally regulate yourself so much better. You won't lose your own temper. You only lose temper because you don't know what else to do and you get frustrated.
Yeah, just like you said to me in the podcast, that I was saying it's triggering because I felt anxious about it. And that's because we don't have a plan. I don't believe I can cope with this. And I guess just to summarize the theme on siblings, we're talking about it because it's so important. Siblings relationships are so important. And parenting siblings doesn't need to be so hard. There's a part of it that thinks it's just hard. It's just difficult. And of course, there is an element of truth to that. But there is also a part of the equation where we can preempt and plan and make it a bit easier. Like we don't have to put up with all the bickering and the whining. That there's a better way to navigate it.
Yeah, 100%. Awesome. I think the only thing maybe we missed is the other side of it, which is we don't want our siblings just to not fight with each other. We want them to be like close and be good friends. And as you said at the very beginning, positive sibling relationships are super important. Maybe that was on before the mic was on, I don't know. But it's super important. And we want to foster sibling positivity. And by teaching them social skills, teaching them how to navigate conflict and how to share and to give each other compliments and to do perspective taking. Not only are those lifelong skills, it brings them closer to each other because they learn how to apply them in that relationship. And so when you're making your plan, if that's part of the the plan, it can bring them closer as well. And you want to construct
Yeah, catch them
activities.
when they're good.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, catch them when they're good with each other.
The example I like to use all the time is that parents throw their kids into another room and they're like, oh, good, they're playing with each other. I'm going to go wash dishes or fold laundry or catch up on 1,000 emails or whatever. And then they play together nicely and they're sharing and they're high fiving and they're doing whatever, getting along really well. And there's no parenting happening, there's no involvement. And then as soon as one of them starts to yell at the other, then you like run downstairs or wherever they are and you start yelling, you two cut that out, what's going on now, you be nice to your sister, you do this. And it gives all the attention to the negative encounter and none to the positive. We want to really highlight those good moments and be parents when the good stuff is going on.
Absolutely. Yeah, like another thing that you said the last time we spoke was we tend to parent when they're bad, not when they're good. And it's it's true, like we're rewarding inadvertently the behavior we don't want to see, and we're not setting them up to succeed. I think as a parent, we all want our kids to get on. I don't think I was aware of how important it is for them to have a good relationship, like how protective it is for their happiness, for their longevity, until I started speaking to you. So that's going to be a big priority for me. And in my work generally, to have my sibling goggles on so that I think about that generally.
I love the sibling goggles image. That's a good one.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Thank you so much, John. This has been amazing, as every conversation that we've had together. And I really recommend that people get your book, Raising Loving Siblings, because honestly, it can be done. We can raise loving siblings. And some of us think that it looks really difficult, but it's not. And you've got lots of really useful tips and ways of these rules of engagement that I think are so powerful. You give lots of example of that, and also very validating to the challenge that we face.
No, thanks for all of that. I'm glad that the book was helpful. And I support your recommendation for other people to read it.
That's lovely. Thank you so much.